The journey began on January 27, 1959, in the remote town of Ivdel, deep in the Ural Mountains. Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, gathered his team of 8 experienced hikers for what was supposed to be a standard, though challenging, winter expedition to Mount Otorten. The team was carefully selected. They were all seasoned hikers with years of experience in mountain terrain. Among them were Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, Semyon Zolotarev, and Yuri Yudin. The group departed Ivdel by truck and reached the last inhabited settlement of Vizhay on January 26th. The next day, they traveled by truck to a logging camp, and on January 28th, Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of the team, was forced to turn back due to a severe leg injury, leaving 9 people to continue toward their destination. The hikers kept meticulous journals, noting the weather, their progress, and their morale. On January 29th, they reached the Lazva River, following its frozen banks toward the mountains. They moved through deep forests and over open plains, documented in the rolls of film they carried in their heavy packs. On January 31st, the terrain shifted as they reached the edge of the highland plateau. They realized they would not be able to carry all their supplies on the final ascent to Mount Otorten, so they established a supply base at the edge of the forest. They left a portion of their food and extra equipment in a designated cache, intending to return to it on their way back. This allowed them to travel light and fast toward the mountain peak. On February 1st, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. A storm front moved in from the north, bringing plummeting temperatures and high-velocity winds that made navigation nearly impossible. Despite the conditions, the group attempted to move forward toward the pass. They veered off their planned route, likely due to the lack of visibility caused by the driving snow, and instead of crossing the pass, they began to climb the slope of Kolitsyakal. This name, Mountain of the Dead, was known to the local indigenous Mansi people, though the hikers were not deterred by the local myths. They reached the slope, which was exposed to the full force of the wind, and decided to stop. It was a critical decision point. They cut a level area into the hard-packed snow and anchored their large, heavy canvas tent. Their final journal entry was written that evening, describing their fatigue but also their determination. They ate their dinner, dried their clothes, and prepared for sleep, completely unaware that the morning would never come for them. This was the last time the 9 hikers were documented together, alive and in control of their own fate. The rescue mission, which would eventually reveal the state of this campsite, was still weeks away, and the events that would unfold in the dark of that February night remained the central point of the mystery. They left the tent in a state of order, with their boots and outer layers left exactly where they had placed them, suggesting they felt entirely safe when they finally lay down to rest. When the rescue team, led by volunteer students and local foresters, finally reached the slope of Kolitsyakal on February 26th, the scene they discovered was incomprehensible. The tent was partially collapsed, sagging under the weight of the snow that had accumulated since the storm. As the rescuers approached, they noted that the tent had not been disturbed by an avalanche. It remained anchored exactly where the hikers had placed it. However, the most disturbing sight was the fabric of the tent itself. It had been slashed open from the inside, with long, ragged tears running down the canvas, as if the occupants had desperately fought to escape something that was inside or immediately surrounding the tent. The rescuers found the personal belongings of the 9 hikers scattered within the tent. Cameras, journals, flashlights, and expensive winter coats were all left behind untouched. There were no shoes, no heavy parkas, and no equipment that would be necessary to survive the sub-zero temperatures outside. The rescuers discovered a line of footprints in the snow, beginning right outside the tent and leading down the mountain toward the edge of the forest, about 1.5 kilometers away. The tracks were strange. They were made by people in socks or even barefoot, and they were spaced out as if the hikers had been walking normally, not running in a panic. The trail led directly to a large, old cedar tree at the forest line. At the base of this tree, the rescuers found the first 2 bodies, those of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. They were laid out on a makeshift bed of branches, wearing only their underwear, and a small fire had been lit nearby, but it had long since burned out. The bark of the cedar tree was scarred and torn, indicating that someone had attempted to climb the tree, perhaps to reach for branches to fuel the fire or to get a better vantage point of the tent on the slope above. Near these 2, the rescuers found the remains of 3 more hikers, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. They were spread out in a line between the tree and the tent, with their bodies positioned as if they had been trying to crawl back to the safety of the campsite. They were dressed in varying degrees of night clothes, and there were no signs of a struggle between them. It appeared they had simply collapsed from exhaustion and the extreme exposure of the mountain night. The discovery of these 5 bodies was just the beginning of the horror. The remaining 4 hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotarev, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Alexander Kolevatov, were not found until May, after the snow had begun to melt. They were discovered in a deep ravine further into the forest, buried under 4 meters of snow. Their bodies were in a state of decay that made identification difficult, but the physical findings were even more unsettling than those of the first 5. Forensic reports, which would later become the center of a massive public controversy, indicated that these 4 had suffered massive internal trauma, broken ribs, and fractured skulls. Yet there were no external lacerations or skin bruising. It was as if they had been crushed by an immense, invisible force, but the surrounding snow was entirely undisturbed. One of the hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue and eyes, a detail that the rescuers could not explain. The clothes they wore were also an anomaly. Some of the hikers in the ravine were wearing pieces of clothing taken from the hikers who had died at the tree, suggesting they had stripped the dead to keep themselves warm. The official Soviet investigation into the incident began almost immediately, but from the start, the authorities were faced with a conflict between the evidence at the site and the reality of mountain conditions. The investigators interviewed the rescue team, collecting testimonies that detailed the eerie condition of the site. They measured the distance from the tent to the cedar tree, mapped the layout of the footprints, and took thousands of photographs of the area. One of the most perplexing pieces of evidence was the camera roll found in Dyatlov's camera, which showed the group in high spirits just hours before the tragedy. The investigators analyzed the gear for any signs of criminal activity, such as theft or foul play, but they found no proof that anyone else had been on the mountain that night. The Montsi tribespeople, who lived in the region, were questioned extensively. They were deeply familiar with the terrain and the dangerous weather shifts of the Ural range, but they told the police that they had not seen any strangers in the past during the entire week the hikers were there. The authorities even looked into the possibility of a military accident or secret weapons test, given the strange, slightly radioactive dust detected on some of the hikers' sweaters. This finding was documented in the police logs, but was quickly buried by higher-ranking officials who did not want to pursue a connection to the Soviet military-industrial complex. The forensic pathologists who work in the bodies were pressured to produce results that fit a narrative of natural death. They cited the extreme cold as the primary cause of death for the first 5 hikers, but they had no explanation for the horrific internal injuries of the 4 found in the ravine. When the medical examiners pointed out that the skull fractures could not have been caused by a fall or a standard struggle, they were told to stop asking questions about the internal trauma. The files grew thick with testimony, maps, and diagrams, but the contradictions never faded. The investigators looked for signs of an avalanche, but they found no debris, no displaced snowpack, and no evidence that the mountain slope had ever shifted. The tent, anchored into the side of the slope, was proof that there had been no significant movement of the earth, as it remained in its original location. The investigators turned their attention to the group's journals, looking for clues about the night's events. The final journal entries were mundane. They described the day's trek, their plans for the next morning, and the cold, but they mentioned no panic, no external voices, and no sense of dread. The police eventually concluded their work without being able to identify a single perpetrator or a logical explanation for the deaths. In May 1959, the investigation was officially closed. The documents were classified, labeled top secret, and sent to a regional archive where they remained hidden for years. Many of the lead investigators were told to never discuss what they had seen on the slope of Koletsyakhl, a move that only added to the suspicion that the state knew more than it was telling. The families of the victims were left without closure, holding on to personal notes and photos of their lost children, while the mountain pass was left to become a place of legend. The mystery surrounding the Dyatlov Pass hikers persisted because the evidence defied every logical explanation available at the time. Experienced mountaineers do not abandon their boots and heavy coats to walk into a blizzard without a reason, and they certainly do not suffer massive internal trauma without external impact. The investigation was not just about finding a cause of death, it was about reconciling the impossible sequence of events that unfolded on that slope. Decades later, modern scientists returned to the site, using advanced computer models to simulate wind patterns and weather conditions. They suggested that the hikers may have been caught in a rare, localized weather event known as a katabatic wind, which can reach hurricane force and create enough pressure to disorient anyone caught in it. Yet, this does not explain the internal injuries or the missing eyes. Others have pointed to the potential for strange infrasound, a low-frequency sound caused by wind rushing through mountain passes, which can induce feelings of extreme anxiety and even physiological distress in humans, potentially causing the hikers to flee in a state of terror. These theories remain speculative, just as the original police file remains incomplete. The story of the 9 hikers has been told, retold, and analyzed by investigators across the globe, and still, the truth remains obscured. We have reviewed the accounts of the rescuers, the forensic findings, and the final thoughts written in their journals. The legacy of Dossier 55 is a lesson in how even the most prepared individuals can be defeated by forces that we do not fully understand. We honor the memory of the hikers by continuing to look at the facts. Their tragedy reminds us that the wilderness is not a place to be trifled with, and that there are mysteries in the natural world that remain beyond our reach. The records that remain are a testament to their resilience and their friendship. They went to the mountains to find adventure, and they became a permanent fixture of history. The investigation was as thorough as the era permitted, but the nature of the injuries is a puzzle that keeps the story alive in every generation of explorers. The truth regarding the force that drove them out of the tent remains hidden in the archives, waiting for those who continue to look at the facts. Never stop asking questions and never stop exploring the unknown. The world is waiting for your discovery. The search for knowledge regarding the hikers continues. They vanished in 1959, but their presence in the record is permanent. The story of the hikers serves as a reminder of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted. We have laid out the facts, the accounts, and the questions that keep investigators looking at the past. The case may be cold, but the facts remain. As we move forward, let these lessons remind you that the world is bigger than we think, and there are always new stories waiting to be told. You have walked the path of the investigator, felt the weight of the mystery, and seen the impact of the tragedy that changed the history of the Ural Mountains. May your curiosity lead you to your own great discoveries, and may your own story be one worth telling. Subscribe to Mind 74. If you reached the end, thank you for being the best adventurers out there. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a dossier. Comment below. What do you think happened to the hikers? Share this video with your best friends and join the hunt. We'll see you at the next mystery. Keep exploring.